So this period, when it is facing one of the most serious kind of challenges all around, the question is, did China's international behavior, particularly in the form of the wolf diplomacy, its problems at a time when it is facing so many challenges? I mean, it's important to realize that the Chinese have been battling this problem of perception, not just now. I think if you go back to the origins of the China rise, they started to speak of the rise of China, saying that this was the peaceful rise of China, because the China rise theory and the threat of China was something that they attempted to address and battle throughout the latter part of the 90s. That's one set of issues that an attempt by China to change the perception and therefore the try and win the battle of the narrative, because the narrative, as we can see, is full of the dominant narrative, that is to say, is full of very negative kind of way in which China, whether we take this whole question of, well, China peaked, that China is not, its rise is not a certainty. It's a faltering power. Its demography is on the decline. Its manufacturing is declining. Human rights is obviously a matter of question. So, there is an entire narrative, and then there is lab leak and the fact that the Chinese were responsible for unleashing this virus on the world. So I think that's a huge set of questions. And one additional set of remarks I'd like to make about this whole notion of soft power, because this whole idea of Lovable is to start addressing the question of its soft power. And by Kanti Bajpayee, in which he cites the work of, you must be familiar with her work, Paramas Sinha Palit's work, in which she analyzes China's soft power strategy. Now, he comes to this conclusion that particularly in Southeast Asia, which is the region you will, the India and China contestation for soft power is actually in China's favor. And therefore, there are some very, very significant questions that arise out of it. And just put it on the table for you if it's the scope of your presentation. So before I finally hand it to you, now I'm going to take the liberty of calling upon Ambassador Kishan Rana to make just a couple of brief remarks. I think more than anybody else in this country, he has written on China's diplomacy and public diplomacy, and particularly this issue of perceptions and projections. And I think he could just give us a couple of important ideas as well to put on the table. So can I request Ambassador Rana to just come in with 2-minute kind of a point presentation?
Thank you very much, Alka. I was really not expecting to come in that early in the session. And I'm shifting to a location where maybe the connection is a little more stable. Can I be heard now? Am I?
Yes, I can hear you. I couldn't quite hear Alka.
Okay, I think there are, at least I'm having some small connection problems, and maybe I'll start my video as well so that I'm vaguely visible. Anyway, Anurag, thank you very much. A very interesting theme. I now realize that you have, in a sense, put the debate, today's discussion, within a slightly narrower frame than what I thought you might address. It seems that you are planning to focus only on the COVID issue and the impact of COVID, and whether China's vaccine diplomacy has helped to improve its lovableness, if we want to call it that. But going beyond the pandemic, important and shall we say devastating as it has been, as Alka pointed out, this is part of a much larger issue, and I hope very much that you also put in the frame some of the wider aspects of China's continuous efforts for the past 15, 20 years and longer to become lovable. And the huge amount of money that China spends on projecting its personality. I have to disagree very slightly with Alka. I don't know if India is losing, quote unquote, the soft power battle. Firstly, soft power is impossible to quantify. So we can't really say who's winning and who's losing. We can only have our perception of what's happening. Thank you very much, Alka. I'm deeply obliged to you.
Okay,
Sorry
thank
for
you. Thank you, Ambassador Rana. Just a clarification, it was not me who was saying that we are losing the soft power battle. This is the argument which has been very strongly put forward by Kanti Vajpayee in a book, citing a lot of sources, citing Pew and many other researchers. And he's trying to, yeah, he admits that it's very difficult to quantify soft power and perceptions of lovableness or otherwise. But his research leads him to the conclusion that on many parameters of soft power, actually China is ahead. So I'm really looking forward now, Anurag, to hear you about whether China is ahead and whether it is lovable intentions. Over to you, Anurag.
So thank you very much, Alka, and thank you for the very generous introduction. I am genuinely delighted and honored to be a part of the Wednesday seminar. Good afternoon to all of you. Thank you so much for logging in. A special thanks to Professor Mohanty, Professor Patricia Oberoi, and all the dear young colleagues at ICS. I wish I was there in person at Rajpur Road, but I guess soon enough. So today I'll be speaking on lovable China in times of COVID-19, intentions and missteps. I've taken a little bit of creative liberty, and I will be focusing on Southeast Asia. Today my presentation is divided into three parts. The China that can be lovable. As you know, Xi Jinping publicly called out that China should be lovable. This was at the group study session of the Politburo of the Central Party Committee. Quite unusual and very interesting, but not very surprising, given the tone and tenor of China's foreign policy. There have been the wolf warrior diplomats. I came across a very interesting statistic. Oxford Internet Institute, apparently between 2020, June 2020 and February 2021, China's diplomats have tweeted 778 times a day. So not very surprising, given that China is also embroiled in a lot of disputes, Doklam, East China Sea, and South China Sea. The second part of my presentation is going to focus on why COVID-19 vaccine diplomacy has been a huge opportunity for China, a golden opportunity for China. And the last part of my presentation, why COVID-19 vaccine diplomacy is not making China lovable. Ever so often, there are a few terms, a few words, a few phrases that are very important in China's political lexicon. So today I wanted to focus on the catch-all phrases in China's foreign policy. I wanted to focus on the latter part of the headline, Chuanpo, which is advertise, how, good, Chungko, China, Sheng In, advertise the good side or the good facade or the good face of China. There has been a slight modification in the tone of China's foreign policy. The new keywords are qianshun, qianhe, modesty and humility in China's foreign policy, nuli, suzao, Kershin, Nuli is hard work, Suzao is create, Kershin is credible, Kerjing, the Chungko Xingxiang. So a credible lovable and respectable image of China. Xi Jinping has also focused on a public opinion struggle. So there is the Western narrative and there is China's narrative, and the importance and the criticality of getting of getting the Chinese narrative out there. And the third important point, which Xi Jinping stressed, was to tell China's story well. Jiang Hao, Chung Kuo, Kushi. So, three important points: credible, lovable, respectable image of China. There is a public opinion struggle and the need and necessity of telling China's story well. So China wants to be lovable. Does this mean that China is feeling unloved? Well, ever since Xi Jinping came to power, ever since 2012, the 18th Party Congress, Xi Jinping has done a lot for China and for the world. There is the Asian Investment Infrastructure Bank, there is the New Development Bank, and there is this flagship project, the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. Xi Jinping has consistently focused on Tian Xia, under the heaven, Yi Jia, that is under heaven, one family, the notion of a shared destiny for mankind. And in recent times, China has dominated the global PPE supply, so personal protective equipment. So whether it's the N95 masks that we wear, the four-ply masks, disposable masks, the gloves, the gowns, the protective glasses, it is China that is in lead of the PPE supply. So, why has COVID-19 vaccine diplomacy been a golden opportunity for China? As you know, in 2020, President Trump withdrew from WHO. He announced that US is going to withdraw from WHO. And the US also got on board the COVAX vaccine sharing scheme rather late in the day. But by 2020, vaccines had already started becoming available. But the West, as you know, started focusing on me first. And India, as you know, was forced to withdraw. In other words, default, it was open road. It was open field for China to become the largest supplier and the largest exporter of COVID-19 vaccines. If you look at July 2021 statistics, Sinopharm vaccines are exported to 64 countries and Sinovac to 34 countries. That's 240 million doses. And they have committed to 500 million doses. So in comparison, if you look at the last line, Covishield and Covaxin, it goes to 66 million doses have been sent out to 95 countries. So China, 98 countries, India, 95 countries, China, 240 million doses, India, 66 million doses. So Pfizer has gone to about 102 countries and AstraZeneca to 274 countries. I was unsure about Moderna, but I'm sure one of the younger colleagues will help me find the exact number. So why are COVID vaccines not making China not making China lovable? I wanted to focus on Southeast Asia. I wanted to focus on this region because, as you know, Southeast Asia is adjacent to China. It is a region, the Nanyang, which has seen a lot of immigration historically. This is regarded as the sphere of Chinese influence. This is also a political hotspot. It is politically volatile. As most of you know, it's the South China Sea. And it is considered as China's backyard, China's backwaters. What is a bit of a paradox about this region is that most of these countries look to China for trade and they look to America for security. For instance, you have Philippines, which has the VFA with the US, but it has build with China. And similarly, you have Singapore, where the naval bases are used by the US Navy, but at the same time, the connectivity corridor is with China. So in this region, last year, there were very few cases and very few deaths. But this is not so. But this is not so this year. As you can see, a smattering of headlines from across this region. This region, Southeast Asia, is now the COVID epicenter. So Indonesia, left-hand side of the screen, has overtaken India to become Asia's COVID epicenter. Vietnam has seen a huge surge of cases. In Singapore, we are on heightened alert, largely because of a KTV lounge cluster. In Philippines, there has been the first death due to the Delta variant. In the middle, you can see the 7-day moving average. So if you look at it very closely, in Indonesia, the cases are rising. In Malaysia, the cases are rising. In Thailand, the cases are rising. In Japan, Myanmar, South Korea, Singapore, the cases are rising. But it's only in India that the cases are falling. So why are COVID vaccines not making China lovable? I wanted to talk a little bit about Southeast Asia, the vaccination progress. All the statistics that is cited is from Johns Hopkins. So Singapore, 49% vaccinated. Indonesia, 6% vaccinated. Malaysia, 15%. Thailand, 5%. Philippines, 4%. Taiwan, apparently 25% of the population has received the first jab. Vietnam, below 1%, and India, 7%. So Indonesia, 6%, India, 6.8 to 7%. But the moot point here is that if you look at this very closely, Singapore has Sinovac, Indonesia has Sinovac, Malaysia has Sinovac, Thailand has Sinovac, Philippines has Sinovac and Sinopharm, and Vietnam has Sinopharm. It's Taiwan which has AstraZeneca and Pfizer, and India, of course, Covishield, Covaxin, and Sputnik. Well, Chinese vaccines in Southeast Asia have been getting very bad press. This has largely been because of the deficiencies of Chinese vaccines. And by deficiencies, I mean the efficacy of Chinese vaccines. As you know, Sinovac has an efficacy rate of 51%. This basically means that if 100 people were jabbed with Sinovac, 51 would not get it, but 49 would. So in comparison, you have Pfizer and Moderna, where the efficacy rate is more than 90%, Covaxin and Covishield more than 70%. So Malaysia has decided to stop Sinovac once the stock finishes, to phase out Sinovac. Indonesia and Thailand, they're roughly following the same model. So Thailand is the first country to have a mix and match. So for those who've taken the first jab of Sinovac, they can either go for a booster shot of AstraZeneca or a second shot of AstraZeneca. Indonesia has confirmed order to AstraZeneca. And if you look at the vaccination queues in Philippines, the queues for Pfizer are very long and the queues for Sinovac have been very short. And in Thailand, Moderna was offered online by a Thai hospital and they ran out in a couple of minutes. So to examine this further, what is happening in this region, I'll be discussing what is happening in a few countries, starting with Singapore. Singapore has a national health vaccine program, and Singapore ordered Pfizer, Moderna, and Sinovac. They were largely hedging their bets. So the first batch of Sinovac arrived in February. In March, the Prime Minister, Lee Hsien Loong, he gave an interview to Talking Business Asia, the BBC, and he suggested vaccines were vaccines and that vaccines had no nationality. He also said something to the effect that Singapore was not under pressure to accelerate vaccine program because of the low community cases. Now, this was interpreted by observers as meaning that China was pressurizing Singapore to use Sinovac in the national health vaccine program. Interestingly, if a person has been jabbed by Sinovac in Singapore, the Sinovac vaccine recipients are not included in Singapore's national vaccination count. So for any MICE is basically meetings, incentives, conferences or exhibitions. For those who've taken Sinovac, pre-testing is essential. On an aside, just a couple of weeks ago, Singapore had eased restrictions, and 5 people could go and dine out. But if you were jabbed with Pfizer or Moderna, you could gather together or congregate together, but this was not applicable to those who'd taken the Sinovac jab. So what is happening in Indonesia? Indonesia, the cases have been surging about 54,000 cases a day. And that is very high given the population of Indonesia is 270 million. There has also been a lot of vaccine hesitancy in Indonesia. The fact that on social media and TikTok, there has been discussion whether the Chinese vaccines are haram or are they halal. So 100 million vaccines Indonesia has received, Sinovac and Sinopharm. But in Indonesia, more than 1,000 health workers have died, including 545 doctors. You can see this picture on the bottom of the screen. It's a picture of Novelia Bachtiar. She was the lead scientist who was leading the Sinovac trials in Indonesia. She contracted COVID and she passed away. So her story was very much in the news in this region. So there have been big orders of Pfizer and AstraZeneca from Indonesia. If you look at the right side of the screen, you can see December 2020, January 2021, largely Sinovac. But if you look at July 2021, it's the US government that is sending donations. It's Sinovac, Sinopharm, but also donations from the Japanese government, AstraZeneca, and COVAX. So what has been happening in Malaysia? Again, Malaysia, a lot of cases, 17,000 cases a day. The number seems to be quite small, 17,000 cases. But if you look at Malaysia's population, it's 32 million, and India's population is 1.35. So 1.35 divided by 32 million, that's about 40 something. That multiplied by 17,000 cases, it's equivalent to 7 lakh cases in India. I'm just using this to give a perspective and to set a context as to how grave the situation is in Malaysia. So Malaysia, the west coast has been affected, Selangor, Kuala Lumpur, and the Klang Valley. So Malaysia has announced that they will be phasing out Sinovac once the stock is over, and they're moving to Pfizer. So US has donated 1 million Pfizer shots, and Malaysia is also receiving 25 million doses of Pfizer by July, September this year. So as you can see on the right-hand side, the headline, Malaysia to stop using Sinovac. This is what the health minister has announced. In Thailand, again, the number of cases is very high, almost 15,000 cases. That is equivalent to 3 lakh cases per day. And the Chinese vaccine Sinovac has been received with a great deal of suspicion and hostility because it was pushed by the military junta, the government of Prayut Chan-o-cha. But as I mentioned before, it is the first country to mix and match. So it's Sinovac, your second dose or your booster shot can be AstraZeneca. All the frontline workers who have taken the Sinovac jab are going to be given the AstraZeneca as the second jab. According to a recent report by Thammasat University, most of you know that Thammasat University is a very, very important university in Thailand. This was the scene of the October massacre in 1976, so Thailand's Tiananmen moment in 1976. So Thammasat University and the National Center for Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology, they released a report, and the report said that in case a person has been jabbed with 2 doses of Sinovac, the level of antibodies drops by 50% every 40 days. But what has really caused a scandal in Thailand has been a leaked internal memo. And it was this leaked internal memo which raised concerns about Sinovac's efficacy. On the right-hand side, you can see a headline from the South China Morning Post. South China Morning Post, owned by Jack Ma, Alibaba. And it says Thailand's fed up doctors are demanding that the government switch to mRNA vaccines. In Philippines, again, there is a clear vaccine bias, and most of the people seem to prefer Pfizer. As I mentioned earlier, the queues for Pfizer have been very long, and the queues for Sinovac have been very short. This is a picture of the President Duterte, who's receiving Sinopharm. He received a jab of Sinopharm when it had not yet been approved. So it created a huge controversy because the rest of the country was being jabbed with Sinovac, but he took a shot of Sinopharm. So a lot of controversy as to whether he believed more in the efficacy of Sinopharm over Sinovac. Vietnam. So the other countries, Indonesia or Singapore or Philippines, they had ordered Sinovac. But China donated Sinopharm to Vietnam. But China also insisted that Vietnam use Sinopharm to jab the Chinese nationals in Vietnam or the Vietnamese nationals who were working in China, or those who lived in the border areas of China and Vietnam. Now, again, this created a big controversy because this goes against the grain of vaccine diplomacy, and China was perceived as a transactional power. Again, a lot of anti-Chinese vaccine sentiment in Vietnam. So this explains the headline on the right-hand side, why Vietnam agreed to inoculate the Chinese nationals with the vaccines which had been donated by China. And Vietnam, the headline here, Vietnam to vaccinate Chinese nationals soon after complaints. So the complaints came in from China. So this is my last slide before I move to the discussion points, and this is Taiwan. So Taiwan wanted to secure the BioNTech vaccines directly from BioNTech. But China, as you know, regards Taiwan as a part of its territory, and BioNTech has a distribution deal for China with Shanghai Fosun. So China insisted that the BioNTech vaccine be routed to Taiwan through Shanghai Fosun. But Taiwan, again, this is a bit complicated, has a regulation against drugs or vaccines made in China. So Taiwan eventually found a way out, and it was Taiwan's Foxconn and Taiwan's Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, which bought and donated to the Taiwanese government. This controversy actually generated a lot of sympathy and donations for Taiwan. As you can see from the screen, US tripled its vaccines for Taiwan with a 2.5 million dose shipment. In Japan, the vaccination rates are very low, and yet Japan decided to ship millions of vaccines to Taiwan. And Lithuania, which opted out of 17 plus 1, so it's no longer 17 plus 1, it's 16 plus 1, the grouping that China has with Central and Eastern European countries. So Lithuania also decided to donate about 20,000 vaccines to Taiwan. So some thoughts for consideration. China is a rising power, and China is catching up with the West. But there is a huge technological gap. There appears to be a huge technological gap between China and the West, which is glaring. So China went the route of the old, the traditional, the tried and the tested way of using the inactivated virus. But perhaps it is the West that made a technological breakthrough with the mRNA vaccines. As I mentioned before, Sinovac's efficacy is 51%, which is just over the WHO threshold of 50% efficacy. In comparison, Pfizer and Moderna have 90% efficacy, and Covaxin and Covishield have 70% efficacy. There has also been a lot of controversy regarding the transparency of China's clinical trials and clinical data, whether they have undergone rigorous peer review. There has also been controversy over China's testing, whether China has tested the efficacy among those above the age of 59, those who are elderly, and those with comorbidities. There is also a lot of speculation and controversy whether the Chinese vaccines are effective against the Delta variant. In what appears to be a faux pas, George Cao, who's the head of the Chinese Center for Disease Control, Cao Fu, in a press conference in April 2021, he said that Chinese vaccines have a low protection rate. He later retracted the statement and said that it had been a misunderstanding. So it appears that China has taken all this as an example of anti-China bias and selective reporting, Yulun Tochang, or public opinion struggle. So China's vaccine diplomacy opportunity, the idea to make China lovable, this is running into difficulties in Southeast Asia. So before I conclude, and before the floor is open for discussion, I will address what Professor Kanti Bajpai has discussed with specific mention of the new Pew Spring Global Attitudes Survey, in which 9 out of 10 Japanese regard China in negative light. And it's the same in New Zealand, Australia, and South Korea, but we can discuss about this during the discussion. So before I sign off, I wanted to give you something to chew on, that China itself is now going to approve mRNA COVID-19 vaccine soon. So the headline in Fortune, it said 1.4 billion doses later, China is realizing it may need mRNA COVID vaccines. Thank you very much. I still can't hear. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. I can't hear you, Alka. I can't hear you.
Sorry, I had muted it during your presentation. Am I triple now? Fine. So thanks a lot once again. That was in fact quite fascinating. You had me riveted about the kind of intricacies that exist within the Southeast Asian countries about this entire vaccine business. So yes, I mean, clearly the question that comes to my mind immediately is that was China trying to make itself lovable by this vaccine diplomacy? I mean, the fact that you cited Xi Jinping's objectives about how China has to now look at projecting itself, telling the China story well, showing its hard work, the whole, the entire thing. But when you started to look at lovable China in the context of vaccine diplomacy, the question is really whether this was an objective. Clearly, it was meant to project influence, but the fact is that it was interspersed with all sorts of diktats. You will only use our vaccine for our nationals. Don't use them in this category. Don't use them in that. And then, of course, the results of the efficacy of those vaccines themselves. So I'd like to know whether there was a link between the objective of making itself lovable and its vaccine diplomacy. I think the second question that arises here is that if we are looking at really this whole objective of making China lovable in the context of expanding its soft power, then there are clear contradictions in the way in which China is going about this. Mm-hmm. So again, I feel that this whole issue of vaccine diplomacy becomes a big, big matter insofar as its contest with the West is concerned. It's not just the West which has the monopoly over providing vaccines, that even we have the kind of technology and we also have the capability to produce these vaccines. So whether it was to make themselves lovable or whether it was more to do with its contest with the West in this regard is really the kind of question that emerges. But having said that, I'm just going to open the floor up and please, Shruti and others, help me to identify the hands that are raised. I don't see.
Ambassador Rana has raised his hand.
Alka, only the reception.
Yeah, Ambassador Rana. So
only the reception.
I am sorry, I must be my bandwidth or something, but I hope you can hear the others better. Ambassador Rana, please, your question, comment, whatever.
Thank you very much, Alka. I'll be brief. First of all, congratulations, Anurag. A very tightly focused, a very data-driven presentation, extremely comprehensible. I just want to say that when it comes to surveys of soft power or comparing countries and their soft power attributes, there is such a profusion of surveys, so much divergence in terms of what each survey tries to capture, that this has almost, in my eyes at least, as somebody who's tried to study public diplomacy for the past 20 years or so, 22 years actually, it has lost credibility. These perception surveys, I would much rather go by something, as you mentioned, I think, a Pew survey. Now, a Pew survey applies certain standards and it has a certain degree of broad credibility, which most surveys don't have. I'm very glad that you mentioned the figures for Japan, but maybe you have data in relation to some other countries as well. It would be nice to hear that. Thank you very much.
There is one question in the chat box, but it is anonymous, so I don't think I'm going to raise it. Maybe, Anurag, you can just start off by addressing the Ambassador Rana's point, and then we'll see who else comes up.
Well, I'll start with the question, the little that I could hear that you asked, Alka. This is regarding whether, China actually wanted to be lovable with respect to the vaccine diplomacy in the region. Well, China has been actively courting this region, and the reaction that it has received is fairly hostile. So it is quite complex, this region, because as I mentioned that most of the countries in this region look to China for trade, but to America for security. So as much as there are contradictions, they have a very complicated relationship with China, starting with Singapore. Many of you may be aware of the huge controversy in Singapore. Singapore has actually published, one of the leading intellectuals in Singapore published a book called China is Messing with Your Mind. A leading academic of the LKY School of Public Policy was asked to leave Singapore on suspicions of spying for a foreign country. It's up to your imagination to conclude as to which was the foreign country that the government was saying. The Prime Minister has gone on record to say that China is a country that has been going around with lollipops in its pockets. In case of Philippines, you know what has been happening. Philippines also renewed the contract with US, which was quite unexpected. So it is Cambodia and perhaps Myanmar and perhaps Thailand. So China is still a very lonely power, as David Shambaugh said a few years ago. It's still a very lonely power with very few allies, genuine allies in the region. To address Ambassador Rana's question, soft power cannot flow from the barrels of the gun, and China has obviously been getting some of its efforts wrong. I wanted to mention about the CGTN media challengers and the new vloggers that China that are vlogging about China. And you must have heard about Raz Galor, who has done a lot of videos on Xinjiang. They're available and easily accessible on YouTube. And similarly, these two English gentlemen, Barretts, have been going around China with videos of China, saying or reflecting on the good side of China, but they do not have the intellectual depth or the intellectual compass, say, of a Edgar Snow. So Galor or Valor and the Barretts are not Edgar Snows and Jonathan Spences. So the credibility, intellectual and academic, is very zilch. So China is obviously trying to make itself lovable, but soft power is something which is organic. It, as I said, it cannot flow out from the barrels of the gun, and it cannot be a top-down effort. So coming back to the Pew survey, this was the first time that the spring survey was conducted in Singapore, and of all the countries that were surveyed, Singapore was the only country that had a favorable reaction towards China. So as I mentioned, Japan, very negative perception. Most of the people in all the countries that were surveyed clearly preferred US over China. So whether it's Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, or Japan.
Well, okay, thank you. We have got two questions and one hand up. So Sandeep will ask his question. Anurag, if you can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you better now.
Okay. So there are two questions here. One is from Aram Ashraf, who wants to know how the Chinese, of course, they all enjoyed the presentation. Everybody's saying that to begin with. So I'm just going to leave that out as understood and read the question straight away. How are the Chinese diaspora living in Southeast Asian countries responding to Chinese vaccine issue? And he wants to know if you have any news on Malaysia ordering 3.5 million doses of a single vaccine from CanSino Biologics. Anurag Thaplial wants to know that China supplied vaccines to nearly 95 countries, and whether China has received any positive response and goodwill from countries other than Southeast Asia, like those in Africa or Europe, if you have any information. So those are the two questions about the vaccine. Sandeep, if you can ask your question now, then Anurag can take those three questions at one go.
Hello. Yes, I think I really enjoyed actually this presentation. It was very interesting to know the dynamics, how things have been basically related to China's soft power diplomacy. My question is about, do we have any knowledge, because you surveyed about news and other opinions inside Southeast Asian country. Do we have any knowledge about whether, because to my knowledge, actually to my understanding, China providing these vaccines, their vaccines, they may be imperfect. They may not be very, you can say, quality products, but China tried to reach out these countries quite early than actually other Western interventions. And what kind of acceptance, what kind of appreciation is there in Southeast Asian countries? Because in my opinion, when we are discussing about China's soft power through these measures, we also need to be very clear that, soft power, again, as mentioned by Mr. Kishan Rana and others, that it's not a one, you can say, attempt thing that you try to become a soft power and overnight you become a soft power. It's a constant, you can say, desire to reach out to you may be incomplete, you may not be able to, you can say, succeed in the initial attempts. But I think whether there's an appreciation in Southeast Asian country that China did try to reach out us and provide some vaccines, even if they were not very, you can say, but again, in long term, probably that's going right now, because vaccines related apprehensions are quite high. So they may not be very positive to China, but in long term, they may evaluate and think that, yes, China did come early and try to help us. So
Thanks, Sandeep. Anurag?
I lost track of the first question, diaspora and Sinovac, but
Malaysia.
Malaysia.
Okay. And the diaspora and Malaysia, two questions. So one is how the response of the diaspora, and the other is Malaysia's ordering 3.5 million single vaccine
from
dose.
A particular.
Yeah.
Well, I actually spoke to somebody in Malaysia just before the talk, and I was discussing a news item in the New Straits Times, which is a newspaper in Malaysia. And the New Straits Times indicates that, Malaysia is still not saying whether Sinovac has ever been part of its national immunization vaccine program. So has it been a part of the national immunization program, or has it not been a part? Two is Malaysia appears to be moving to a scenario where Sinovac can be purchased in a private clinic or in the open market. So it is not going to be given free. It's the same in Singapore. So Pfizer and Moderna are administered free by the vaccine, National Health Vaccine Program. But if you want to take Sinovac, you will have to go to a particular clinic and buy the vaccine. And Malaysia is also moving towards that. As for this 3.5, whether Malaysia is buying that from a particular company, I'm sorry, I do not know the details. But if you're talking about the diaspora, I just wanted to briefly talk about the diaspora here, the in the region. So whether you look at Thailand, Thaksin Shinawat is a Thai Chinese. If you look at Charon Popkhan group, it's a Thai Chinese group. If you look at Krating Deng, the Red Bull, that is also a Thai Chinese group. If you look at Shangri-La, that is Malaysia, it's owned by Robert Kwok, who's one of the richest Malaysian Chinese in the region. If you come to Singapore, you'll see a lot of stations named after Tan Kah Kee. Again, a Chinese from southern China, from Guangzhou or Fujian, I forget which one. Similarly, if you look at Indonesia, I mean, Indonesia has had anti-Chinese riots 1740, 1945, 46, 65, 66, and most recently in 1998. But some of the richest Indonesians are Indonesian Chinese, the Sinarmas group, Eka Tipta Vijaya. So the diaspora is extremely strong. And this is why I think Professor Mohanty will agree with me. Several years ago, there was a seminar when Kelly Sai had come at Calcutta. And that is what she specifically worked on Quanxi capitalism, how money has actually gone from Southeast Asia back to China, Quanxi capitalism, which has helped in the development of China, especially coastal China and southern China. The second question, shall I take Sandeep's question?
Yeah, sure.
About, the Chinese vaccines are not perfect vaccines. And China reached out, and despite the efficacy, whether, China's contribution, how should one consider China's contribution? Well, this is again a very tricky question, because these vaccines were not donations. These vaccines were actually bought by the governments. It is only Vietnam which received a donation of Sinopharm. So all these countries, so whether it's Indonesia or whether it's Thailand or whether it's Malaysia or whether it's Singapore, these vaccines were bought by the governments. And of course, the bottom line is what happened to the money and whether the vaccines had efficacy, which explains the massive shift as to why all these countries are moving away from Sinovac to Moderna and Pfizer, largely because of the backlash in these countries. And the third.
Can Professor Mohanty come in here? He has raised his hand.
She has to answer the second question of Anurag Thalpial, that are there some countries out of the 95 countries outside Southeast Asia who have welcomed and they have a positive view of the Chinese vaccine diplomacy?
Well, Mongolia, you know what is happening in Mongolia, and UAE and Costa Rica, which is the world's happiest country. So Costa Rica very recently declined to use Sinovac. That was very much in the news. And again, UAE and Mongolia, there has been a bit of a backlash and hostile attitude towards China. So I cannot speak about the countries in Africa, but at the same time, it's very important to take a very nuanced view of Chinese vaccines, largely because they can be stored at a very appropriate temperature, 2 to 8 degrees. That only AstraZeneca can be stored at between 2 to 8 degrees, whereas Pfizer and Moderna, they need to be stored at minus 70 or minus 80 degrees Celsius. So for several developing countries, Sinovac has come as a boon, but at the same time, now AstraZeneca can also be stored at that particular temperature, 2 to 8 degrees Celsius. So in other words, Sinovac faces tough competition from AstraZeneca.
Okay. Thank you, Anurag. I learned a lot. Our press is not covering in that detail. And you have a very well-argued point. I have two questions. One is about the term lovable. Like becoming Vishwaguru, becoming lovable is another ambition which is a wrong public statement. Because you don't become lovable by a strategy. You work on multiple fronts to gain legitimacy in the minds of people and governments, and make a distinction between people and governments and people of various strata. Because in some countries you may have hostile governments, but almost divided people or friendly people and so on. Okay, and when regimes change, that also changes. I think that point, diplomacy scholars have to take up. I mean, how to formulate questions and targets and objectives in long-term diplomatic strategy, and accordingly follow and formulate policies. So your comment on that, that is one. My specific point about the vaccine technology, I think that's a very good formulation you made, the vaccine technology backwardness, which was proved in this case in China, and 51%, just above the 50% threshold of WHO is not much to write home about. Now, and therefore the mRNA COVID vaccine technology is now, they are going to approve and so on. Now, my understanding is that this is one of the sectors where the technological gap between Europe and US on the one hand and China on the other is huge. Whereas in AI technology or several such Internet of Things and so on, they have made a lot of advances in China in some of this technology, and including some chip technology also, chips technology. There are huge technological gaps. And as far as I know, and the WHO reports always show, the delegation's visit to the Wuhan Immunology Institute and or Virology Institute, whatever, and where there is global cooperation, and so many American scientists have worked there jointly, and so many Chinese scientists have worked also in US laboratories. Despite that, how could China hasten this process? Was it just to make a point, like providing masks or PPEs? They wanted a quick vaccine product. Was it a wrong strategy? How do you react to that?
Thank you, sir, for the questions. I really enjoyed your first question, China wanting to become lovable. I almost think that you have been the ghostwriter for a foreign minister in this region, because he said exactly the same thing. So he said that one cannot become lovable by saying so by words, but by deeds. So it is not just rhetoric. It cannot be top down, and it has to be organic. It cannot be a strategy, as you mentioned. There have to be concrete deeds which make China lovable. So I completely agree with you on that one. With vaccine technology, China's backwardness, this is also a very interesting thing that you have raised. And I wanted to take this a step beyond what you asked, to focus a little bit on how homogeneous China is, and whether China actually allows foreigners to come in and work in China. So if you look at immigration in China, there are not very many people who actually go and work in China. Now, of course, Indians have started going out. So in terms of diversity, in terms of pluralism, China is way behind the US. So if you look at the two scientists in Germany, they're Turkish immigrants. So it is probably time for China to open its doors, not just to ideas, not just to economic reform, but also to people and exchange of people, and to be a little more diverse and plural and heterogeneous, which could actually spark innovation and innovation in a country which obviously has a lot of human talent. And of course, it is very, very important to separate the government from the people. So the government of China is very different from the people of China, and track two diplomacy should never stop vis-a-vis China. The third part about, um, the gap between China and US and Europe, I I I think, or I view at it as the US narrative, US talking constantly about the rise of China. This is exactly what the American argument was vis-a-vis Japan in the 1980s, how Japan was a rising power. And it is America which is doing the same with China right now, to nip the China problem in the bud, rather than to have American leaders in 2 decades from now grasp and grapple with the China problem later on. So American strategy is also very well thought out and very well conceived, and they're doing it in a very refined manner. But China's diplomacy here lacks the diplomatic finesse, and it is still quite rough around the edges.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, but in one sense, it could also be argued that the Americans are already looking at the China challenge. So it's not as if they are preparing now to look at something 20 years down the road, but they're already looking. But I think, yes, there's an interesting debate that comes out of what Manu has raised, that can you become lovable by diktat? And Anurag's point that you cannot strategize. But I do believe that countries have, since Joseph Nye popularized the idea of soft power, but even before that, the idea that there was an appeal appeal of a country on the basis of its culture, its civilization, its knowledge, its traditions, and so on. Now that is being actually very systematically and very coherently strategized. So you have and the funny part of it is that instead of looking at it as a tool of foreign policy, we've decided to give all these different strategies names. So there's yoga diplomacy, and there is everything is given the name of diplomacy. Whereas what we are talking about are different tools in the diplomatic corpus, as it were, to promote and project a country's. So I would slightly differ in the sense that, yes, you can strategize about how to become lovable and how to get your perception changed, except, and the point that is really what Professor Mohanty ultimately, I think, was saying, that your deeds should match your words. that you cannot have a kind of a disjuncture between what you are hoping to do and then what you are actually doing. So China's attempt to be lovable, but on the other hand, unleash these wolf warriors, that's where the gap falls. But we have one question from Nazar Khan. Now, he's asked a question which I think would be beyond the scope of this topic and the theme today. How is the efficacy of vaccines determined? Now, unless Anurag, you want to answer that, I will. But he goes on to add to this question that because efficacy is bound to vary across major variants of COVID-19, and he wants to know any connection of Chinese vaccines with the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So I think we have a very, very pointed question coming your way, Anurag. Yes.
So the second part of the question, whether it's related or connected in any which manner with the Wuhan Institute, I'm afraid I do not know the answer. But the first part, efficacy is again very relative, and it is considered it is interpreted very differently. What does efficacy mean? So it's a very relative term. So if Moderna and Pfizer are saying 90% efficacy, they basically mean that 90% of the people are not going to get it, and 10% may get it. Now, when you have the clinical trials in Indonesia of Sinovac, and there was a statement that these vaccines have possibly more than 70% efficacy but in Indonesia. So this efficacy was again based on that 70% of the people will, if I'm not mistaken, will not die, but they will get it. So the two different categories here, if you can understand the difference. On one hand, they're saying 90% won't get it and 10% may get it. But in Indonesian trials, like 70%, they may not die, whereas the 30% may die. So efficacy is again how it is defined is very relative. And so one really has to go into the details of how efficacy is actually is defined and detailed by the trials in different countries.
Okay, thank you. Now, Rama Baru wanted to ask a question, but I'm informed that she's unable to unmute. Can the hosts unmute her, please?
Yes, she should be able to do it now.
Okay, Rama, just see if you can unmute and ask your question.
I think I'm okay now. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for a very, very interesting presentation. I just want to make 3 points. One, that when the WHO approved the vaccine, the Chinese vaccine at 51% efficacy, I think the point really in public health is that you may have efficacy of 51%, but if you have coverage of 80 to 90%, you pretty much get into the herd immunity and really reduce transmission. So I think while it's true that Pfizer and Moderna may have 90% efficacy, the point really is they haven't been able to cover their populations as well as the Chinese did, even with the 51%. So I think that is an issue which played out. There are a group of scholars in public health who argue that the China's vaccine diplomacy actually filled in the inequalities created by vaccine nationalism of the West. So it's only now that the Americans are willing to sort of part with a few doses here and there, and that's also a part of their vaccine diplomacy. And therefore, the Southeast Asian region, in my view, is being played up by both these superpowers in a way in which, you bring in Pfizer and, you sort of say we are much more efficacious. The third issue which comes out both in the Indian context as well as the possibly the Southeast Asian, is there is a class issue here. That is, those who are globalized want to get Pfizer and Moderna access, even if it means paying a higher price. I mean, of course, you made the point that these were donations from the US. But, there is this pressure, therefore, on the government to say this is much more efficacious. This is also allows me an international passport. Whereas if I have a Chinese vaccine, I may not actually be able to gain entry into many countries. So, I mean, I'm just sort of raising some of these concerns because we've been watching this rather knotted game in the last few months. So just for you, but I enjoyed your presentation so much. Thank you.
The brilliant point, Rama. I think this whole issue where the big pharma companies and these huge corporate interests, which are also driving the manner in which the issue of vaccines are being addressed. And I completely agree with you on this point about the divides, the class divides, and the access that you have. And of course, I think, Anurag, this whole question, I mean, I'd like to know whether the Southeast Asians are actually addressing this question, which is raging throughout the developing world, that vaccines should not become a source of profit and that it should be a global good. And China is taking that position in many ways, whereas the West is seen as actually trying to, favor the farmer. So,
sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just want to say the last point is that when the WHO COVAX facility was set up, of course, China didn't become part of COVAX, as did Russia. But the West did not contribute to the COVAX facility at all.
So how is this perceived in Southeast Asia, this playing ground that you were looking at, Anurag?
Well, it's quite interesting. Thank you for your questions, Rama. But I wanted to indicate, about this question that you raised, the first part of your question, about 80 to 90% herd immunity, that even if a large part of the population is going to take Sinovac, then at some point in time, they will achieve herd immunity. Well, actually, that has not been the case. It is a misconception here. So in China, if you notice very carefully, it's a zero tolerance policy. So basically, if you have a COVID case, or if you have a few dozen COVID cases, there is complete lockdown. And as you know, China has brought into operation the grid form of social control, which it had experimented with in the Tibetan autonomous region and in Xinjiang. So it's zero tolerance policy. It is a model that China follows, and it is a model that Australia follows. So all very good, but what happens when the borders open up? So this probably explains why China, which already has Sinovac, is now looking at mRNA vaccines. So right now they're able to contain it, they're able to isolate, trace, track, and contain. But after the borders open up, it'll be all out in the open. So if you look at China's social media, every second Chinese is actually posting pictures of traveling around or holidaying, or life is normal. But once the borders open up, it is going to be extremely chaotic, which explains why China is also thinking of approving the mRNA COVID-19 vaccine. The second point about inequalities, as I mentioned, none of the vaccines were a donation. They were all bought by the governments. So whether it's Western vaccine or Chinese vaccine, it is government money that has been used. The US, of course, donated vaccines. Japan has been donating vaccines, and China has also donated vaccines. But yes, the West got on the COVAX vaccine sharing scheme very late. It was only Joe Biden, after he was elected, that he got on the COVAX vaccine sharing scheme. So about the class element, whether the upper class or the middle classes actually prefer Moderna over Sinovac. Well, the vaccine program is part of the national immunization program in Southeast Asia. So they are administered free. So there is no choice of, wanting to, there is no issue of people wanting to buy it. So whether you are a taxi driver or whether you're a nurse or whether you are a corporate, this is administered free of charge. Whereas with Sinovac, you actually have to pay and buy. And one of the reasons why many people were buying Sinovac or getting jabbed by Sinovac was because there were rumors that China is not going to let the Chinese nationals who've been jabbed with either Pfizer or Moderna or J&J or AstraZeneca back into China. So China has later on clarified, no, that these other vaccines, Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, and J&J, are going to be recognized by the Chinese government. But until a few months ago, most of the Chinese nationals who work in Southeast Asia, in Malaysia, in Singapore, that was one of the primary considerations as to why they took the Sinovac jab, that they would not be able to return home to see family. So, there is a big difference in how you actually look at, Sinovac here. Could I answer that part of your question? Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
So we're now just about, I think, 5 to 7 minutes away from the closure of this session. So I will read out one more question that has come in the chat box. And if there is anybody else, please raise your hands. You've got the next 1 minute to do so. After that, we will have to start the wrapping up. Athira Anand, who is in IIM Chennai, says, while there is a growing skepticism on vaccine made in China, hasn't China handled the pandemic quite well domestically compared to the United States? Why are we not talking about that? Isn't that the world is becoming more unlovable to China with its economic rise? Okay, so here's a very, very basic question, but I think a tough one, Anurag.
Well, as I just mentioned, China has a zero tolerance policy. It's a zero tolerance model. So if the recent lockdown, I think just 2 or 3 days ago of Nanjing, that happened because of cases that were tracked and people isolated. Similarly, the complete lockdown of Guangdong. But what America is doing is a different kind of experiment. And what England is also doing is a different kind of experiment where the pandemic is endemic. So the pandemic is endemic, and now this pandemic is the new normal, to use Xi Jinping's term. So how can we not love China when we are using Xi Jinping's term of new normal? So the pandemic is the new normal, and life has to continue. So in a certain sense, again, Boris Johnson's experiment in England of opening up everything, one does not know where the experiment will go. But it is not closing the borders. The only way forward is vaccinate. So if you're vaccinated, you can open borders. But China has been 1.4 billion doses of Sinovac. It has been vaccinated, but whether it will be effective when it opens its borders, that is the main question. That is the major question at this point in time. I can't hear you again, Alka. So Alka, can I just take a few minutes, please?
Sure. We have one last question actually from Prabir Chakravarti. You've got precisely 30 seconds if you can ask it, Prabir, and then I want to give the last words to Anurag. You are muted.
Who? I'm not.
No. Prabir, you're muted.
Yeah, I think now I'm unmuted.
Yes.
Anurag, I just want to ask a very, very simple question. If we take the Covaxin from India, are we allowed inside China? This is my simple question. Not Covishield, please.
Okay, so I'm now going to give you the floor, Anurag. You will conclude this session with your final thoughts. And let me in advance thank you on behalf of the Institute of Chinese Studies for a very, very fascinating lecture. Now, all yours.
Thank you very much, Prabir, for your question. I will answer your question, try to answer your question after this discussion concludes. I have very little time. So let me use this precious time to thank Ambassador Kantha. Thank you, Ambassador, for hosting me. The Wednesday seminar is such a huge honor. Thank you, Professor Mohanty. It was great doing my PhD under you. And I have never quite thanked you for being such a brilliant teacher and for asking me always the right questions. Thank you, Professor Oberoi, and thank you very much, Alka. It was absolutely wonderful to see you after such a long time. And again, I could not see all the young colleagues at ICS in person, but I hope to be there in person and interact with Generation Next. So thank you very much, and I look forward to such productive and useful discussions in the future. Thank you.
Well, let me then say, Anurag, that this talk should be seen as part one. We would very much like you to come along with a part two, because the story is just begun. It's just begun to unfold.
Yes, it is evolving. The data
and it is evolving very fast. Yes, and I think we have to. There's going to be more action, particularly as the Russians now, as you know, the Russian scenario is building up very fast, and they are also getting into this whole vaccine diplomacy business. So you will promise us that you will come back in, say, 6 months and give us part two of this particular discussion.
We shall see.
And please do send a message to Prabir and rid him of his curiosity about
whether the Indians can go to China with Covishield.
Yeah. So we will conclude this this Wednesday seminar, and thank you once again, Anurag. Thank you everybody who has asked such interesting questions. A fascinating topic and discussion today indeed. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.